Patriot tends to be reserved for the most expensive and the most damaging of Russian ballistic missiles, and that's kind of why it's so valuable to the Ukrainians, because it's kind of irreplaceable in their arsenal of air defences in terms of what can they use to actually parry the Russian ballistic missile attack.
George Grylls, thank you for speaking to us for The World in 10. Just give us the key information about Patriot and that air defence system. How does it work? Who makes them? How much does it cost? All those key details.
So Patriot is a US system. It's kind of commonly seen as one of the most advanced air defences in the world, and it has been used in Ukraine with great success against particularly Russian ballistic missiles. So ballistic missiles follow a kind of arcing trajectory, and they tend to move the quickest compared to, for example, cruise missiles, and they're the hardest to shoot down. And Patriot, which is this US system, has been pretty effective at shooting them down. One battery costs about £800 million. I mean, it goes up and down, and then if you're for one missile to fire one missile, that costs a few million, 2 to 3 to 4, something like that. It depends on the contract, but it's a pretty expensive piece of kit.
And so, what role does that play in Ukraine's defence at the moment, if it is that expensive?
Well, absolutely vital, but they basically save the missiles. They save using Patriot for ballistic missile attacks. So the cheapest kind of weapon that Russia uses basically every night to attack Ukraine is with drones, Shahed drones, and quite often I've been out with them, but the Ukrainians will just use old machine guns to try and shoot them down, which is the kind of cheapest form of air defense, because it's not really worth sending up a missile to take out something that's only worth, maybe 30,000, 40,000 pounds, something like that. So they wouldn't use Patriot on that. They probably wouldn't use Patriot on a cruise missile either, because they have other air defense systems that could take that out. No, Patriot tends to be reserved for the most expensive and the most damaging of Russian ballistic missiles, and that's kind of why it's so valuable to the Ukrainians, because it's kind of irreplaceable in their arsenal of air defences in terms of what can they use to actually parry the Russian ballistic missile attacks. It's Patriot basically.
And I suppose, what defence does that give them? What are Russia using those ballistic missiles to attack in Ukraine? What damage is spared by using Patriot?
Well, bear in mind, these ballistic missiles also cost millions and millions of pounds. They tend to be used to kind of hit, or they have been in the past couple of years, to try and hit energy infrastructure, or if there's a particularly valuable kind of military target. That's what the Russians would tend to go after with a ballistic missile. And the Ukrainians, I mean, Patriot is portable, so it's basically on the back of a truck. And so the Ukrainians shuttle them around the country, basically on the basis of where they think the Russians are going to attack next. And so, yeah, they try and position them. They try and get ahead of those Russian attacks by positioning them in the right place. But, I mean, it's a pretty safe bet. There'll usually be one in Kiev, at least one in Kiev, one in maybe Odessa, which is their main port, to protect the port infrastructure. So they're really protecting the most strategic sites in Ukraine.
I was struck reading your piece that this technology that Ukraine really wants isn't particularly cutting edge or new. It's been around for years.
Yes, it has, but crucially, it's proven itself in battle over those years. So I think Patriot was first designed, the inventors was first looking at it in the 1970s. So it's really a Cold War piece of kit. But if you look at even the most modern weapons, so Putin boasted about developing a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, claimed it was invincible, impossible to shoot down, and yet Patriot did, in fact, and has on several occasions seemingly shot it down. So even though it's 50 years old, it stands up to even the most modern weapons. And, it's not just Ukraine. I think around the world, people regard it as one of the most reliable air defense systems there is.
Apart from his general reluctance to bankroll Ukraine, why has Donald Trump been reluctant to give any more Patriots from the US's stockpile?
So this was the kind of key. So we had our first phone call between Zelensky and Trump since that infamous now blow-up row in the Oval Office. And during that call, according to the US readout, Zelensky specifically raised air defenses and Patriot and said, basically, can we have a few more? And he's been asking this for a long while, because if you compare, for example, Israel is a small country, so it's they have very, very good air defenses, but they're able to do that because they have a pretty small territory to defend, whereas Ukraine is massive, and so it's pretty tricky to have coverage of everywhere. So Zelensky was basically asking for more batteries of Patriot air defenses to be able to cover more of the country, and Trump seemed to basically say, no, it's up to Europe to do that. And what he's saying is that there are European countries that have Patriot systems themselves. Why don't they give them to Ukraine? And the truth is, some already have. Germany, Romania, Holland. These are countries that have already given systems to Ukraine. The problem is that Europe's kind of anti-ballistic missile defenses are looking pretty threadbare now, and so European countries are pretty reluctant to hand over any more, given that they also have a threat from Russia. And talking specifically about the UK, where I'm sitting right now, the UK has no land-based anti-ballistic missile air defences, so it can't even protect itself, let alone Ukraine. Sorry.
To the layman, you expect Ukraine to be asking for hundreds or thousands of these weapons at a time. In terms of Patriot, Ukraine actually only wants quite a small number, it seems, like 10, a dozen. It's quite a precious commodity, it seems, these Patriot launchers.
Yeah, they are. And I don't think Ukraine would... It's not a realistic ask to get that many, because there's a backlog in the orders for Patriot, because people have seen how they've proven themselves basically since the first Gulf War in the early 90s against Russian missiles, Iranian missiles. They've been used in a fair few conflicts by now, and they work, basically. So people want them. And yeah, there's a backlog, not just for the systems themselves, the launchers, but also the missiles. You need to... It takes a fair while to build an air defense missile itself that is used with Patriot. So... And there is some production happening now in Europe, in Germany, but the production is still mainly centered on the US. And so it's a question of, who's going to pay for this stuff? Who's going to buy the missiles? Because, as Trump has made clear, the US is no longer going to stump up for Ukraine. And it's up to European countries to make it work.
Why is Europe reticent? Because even with the increased threat of Vladimir Putin, it still feels like missiles flying over European territory is a fairly remote prospect.
I don't know about that. I think if you look at the way in which, for example, Iran has attacked Israel with ballistic missiles, if you look at the way that the Houthis, who are basically... a small group in an impoverished country, they've got ballistic missiles and are launching them thousands of miles. We are in an era of proliferating ballistic missile attacks. And if you think that Europe, we're further away from Yemen, where the Houthis have been firing ballistic missiles at Israel, for example. Well, actually, there are broken countries that are much nearer to us. I think, for example, of Libya, where if some sort of terror group were to get hold of a ballistic missile in the same way the Houthis have from the Iranians, suddenly you quite possibly are in range. And the whole of British and, wider European, but particularly British strategy has been, we would only come under ballistic missile attack from Russia, and that would lead to a nuclear escalation, and we have Trident, and Trident is an effective deterrent against that. So they wouldn't dare fire a ballistic missile because it would lead to nuclear war. The problem is that if you've got groups like the Houthis, who are kind of, basically jihadis with little skin in the game, and, why wouldn't they fire one? Because, to be honest, I'm not sure a nuclear deterrent works against a group like that.
Ultimately, the point of this interview, what do you think the likelihood is that Ukraine is going to get more Patriot systems from the US or Europe?
I think it's pretty unlikely Ukraine will get a brand new set of Patriot batteries, but what they will probably get, or is more likely an ask, is that they get the spare parts to kind of keep their existing number. I mean, it's estimated they might have about 6 left. Obviously, it's a closely guarded secret, but they might get the spare parts to keep those systems running, and then also they would like to get that continued supply of air defense missiles themselves so that they can continue to use them, because there's no point having the launchers if you don't have anything to fire from them. So it seems like a pretty straightforward ask. The problem is that someone's going to have to pay to get those missiles.
What are the alternatives to Patriot if Ukraine can't get the launchers that it wants?
That's the problem. There really aren't any. There are a few very good anti-ballistic missile air defenses. Israel has a number of them. You look at their Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, are very, very kind of successful at intercepting ballistic missiles outside of Israeli territory, so much so that the Germans have just decided to buy them, essentially. But no, there are... The Israelis have never kind of indicated that they would ever give military aid to Ukraine, so that's a closed route. So Patriot is the only option if they want to continue to kind of fend off Russian ballistic missile attacks.
I suppose, therefore, if there's no real alternatives and Europe or the US are not going to hand over any more Patriot launchers, if Russia then managed to destroy all of Ukraine's current Patriot systems, to what extent does that swing the war?
It would have a massive effect. I mean, throughout the war, the Russians have not been able to get air dominance over Ukraine. You know, they haven't been able to fly fighter jets over Kiev and just drop bombs on it. They have to fire missiles from basically Russian territory or from further away, which gives air defenses a possibility to shoot them down. But, you know, if Ukraine was deprived of Patriot, and if their air defense system that they've built up started to kind of be chipped away, then, you know, you start to get escalating kind of Russian ability to kind of project their aircraft into Ukraine, and it's a real problem.